Hello everyone, today I would like to do a quick video on G.K. Chesterton's book Orthodoxy. I just want to cover the first chapter, actually the second chapter rather, entitled The Maniac. It's a very interesting chapter, and he talks a lot about concepts related to stuff that we've talked about on this channel before. So I thought it would be interesting just to go through it and maybe relate it to some thinkers and ideas which we've already talked about, such as Zizek and 666. Of course, one of the most popular videos on the channel so far is the video on Zizek and Orthodox Christianity and the logic of 666. So Chesterton will begin this chapter by talking about, I believe, his publisher, who mentions how his publisher is talking about a man, I believe, who's going through some tough times. And the publisher says, quote, "That man will get on. He believes in himself." And Chesterton has issues with this idea of believing in yourself, especially the idea that believing in yourself is somehow a good thing or will solve your problems. And I think I'll just quote Chesterton here. He says, quote, "Shall I tell you where the men are who believe most in themselves? For I can tell you. I know of men who believe in themselves more colossally than Napoleon or Caesar. I know where flames the fixed star of certainty and success. I can guide you to the thrones of the supermen. The men who really believe in themselves are all in lunatic asylums." Unquote. So here, Chesterton is essentially touching on the main thesis of this chapter, which is that pure reason, believing in yourself, a rational belief in your own ability to understand the world, in its most consistent form, is insanity. That believing in yourself, in your own rationality, is the very definition of insanity. And of course, the most extreme form of believing in yourself is literally just believing in yourself, which is solipsism. And I think most of us would agree that if you are a genuine solipsist, you are insane. So this is actually similar to stuff Zizek has talked about in Less Than Nothing and elsewhere, where he talks about how the cogito is mad. I believe there's even a chapter of Less Than Nothing entitled The Mad Cogito. For Zizek, the core of the human being, rather than being a substantial wealth of personality, is the night of the world, the void, a contraction, a withdrawal from reality, and that is the mad cogito. So while Descartes, when he came up with the formula, I think therefore I am, he was trying to ground belief in a rational, objective, irrefutable truth. He was trying to ground rationality. For Zizek, actually, the I think, the pure I, is actually, Descartes was actually one of the first philosophers to truly touch on madness, to understand that at the core of the human being isn't a rationality, or rather we could even say, as Chesterton would, that there is a pure rationality, but this pure rationality is itself insane. The cogito is mad. Zizek will elsewhere talk about how there's a unity of opposites in which you see the identity of two seemingly opposite things. An example he uses is repetition of ordinary acts. So let's take one of the most ordinary acts in at least North American society, that being a handshake. If I were to shake your hand but not let go, and instead just stare into your eyes and repeatedly shake your hand, that ordinary act would not only become not ordinary, but even could be interpreted as sexual, as essentially me being creepy in a sexual way. If I were to go up to a girl and shake her hand, continuously staring into her eyes, most people would consider that rather creepy. And that, of course, the point for Zizek is that the repetition of this ordinary act can become its seemingly opposite thing, the sexual act. This is similar to what Chesterton is saying with how pure reason becomes its opposite, pure insanity. For Chesterton, the main idea of this chapter is that rather than insanity being the product of an excess of imagination, it's rather the a purified reason, rationality, devoid of imagination. It's not imagination that is irrational, rather insane. It's rationality without imagination that is insanity. And to justify his point, he'll say that, quote, "The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. It is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head, and it is his head that splits," unquote. So, of course, the poet is dealing with the realm of the imaginary. The poet is, of course, writing poetry based on his or her imagination, but the logician is concerned with pure rationality, but it's imagination that involves a mysticism that logic cannot accept. It involves an embrace of the unknown, but there can be no unknown to logic. The logic has to account for everything. And it's this idea of accounting for everything that Chesterton has an issue with. And the main example he will reference is materialism. Now, Chesterton will mention how materialism can explain a large amount of things. It can seemingly explain all the activities in the universe. But nonetheless, it isn't a large theory. So even though it can explain a lot of things, even though it can explain a large amount of things, it is nonetheless a small theory. And to understand this, let's talk about the insane person. An insane person can also explain everything that an ordinary person can. For example, let's say the insane man is walking down the street and he sees someone mowing his or her lawn. The insane person may interpret this as the person mowing their lawn as trying to inflict harm on the grass. Or if someone comes up to speak to the insane person, they may think that they're only doing this not as an act of kindness as an ordinary person would, but to find out information on them. So the idea is that, yes, the insane person has an explanation for things that happen to them, for events and for reality, but the explanation, the model that the insane person uses is small. Even though it can explain a large amount of things, it's small because essentially for the insane person, everything revolves around them. And of course, there are different types of insanity, but this is what Chesterton is concerned with. So Chesterton will say that materialism is structurally homologous to insanity because just like insanity, it is a narrow universality. It's possible, Chesterton will say, for something to account for everything in the theory, while nonetheless being small, being narrow. It's possible for an eternity to be cramped. Now, he'll go on to mention how materialists may consider him a slave for not being able to believe in determinism. So it seems like Chesterton is limited by the fact that he's not able to accept determinism. But Chesterton's reply is that he thinks materialists are slaves and limited for not being able to believe in fairies. So, of course, the idea here is that the materialist can't even allow for one drop of spirituality into their explanation of reality. There can't even be a single miracle, or else the entire foundation of the materialist worldview falls apart. And this is essentially the logic of 666, which me and my cousin Nate talked about in our video on Orthodox Christianity and Zizek. The logic of 666 is, as Chesterton put it, a narrow universality. It is an incomplete totality, a totality which attempts to account for everything while itself being limited. It's like a small circle. A small circle is infinite. It goes on forever, but nonetheless, it's still small. And Chesterton will talk about a symbol used by many different belief groups and cults even, the symbol of a serpent eating its own tail. And he points out the irony of the fact that that's a very unsatisfactory meal. So the idea, of course, is that this self-referentiality, what is seemingly a complete totality, an infinite circle, the snake eating its own tail, it's an unsatisfactory meal. It's small. It's a narrow universality. It's a cramped eternity. So what is the quote-unquote solution for Chesterton? It's not the full solution, because that is the task of the entire book. It's coming up with a solution, but essentially the most basic way out of this cramped universality for Chesterton is mysticism. Because mysticism allows for the mysterious, that which cannot be accounted for within a purely rational system, which we can't, it involves something we can't stick into our minds. And mysticism for Chesterton is like the sun, which, while impossible to stare at directly, it's impossible to fully comprehend the mystery. That's the whole point. Nonetheless, the sun provides the light to see everything else. The paradox of mysticism, which a paradox that Chesterton affirms, is that the mystic understands reality through that which they themselves do not understand. And it's this idea of something external to themselves, outside of the realm of our understanding. For in the biblical worldview, that would be the logic of seven, the seventh day. In Genesis, of course, the creation was complete on the sixth day. Nonetheless, we still required this seventh day of rest in order to constitute it as a complete harmonious totality. In the same way, there needs to be this excess, the seven, the mystery, over and above our system of reality, in order to constitute this very system as whole, as complete, as not being a cramped eternity, not being a narrow universality, not being the self-referential, essentially the destruction of the serpent eating itself. Because I don't think it's a coincidence that in the Bible, hell is described as the worm that does not die. And what does a worm do? It eats from the inside. There's this idea of course, there's the idea of the fire of hell, which I interpret as the light of God shining upon the wicked, which is experienced as pain. But there's also this idea is from the inside. There's something at the inside eating away. And I think when you have this logic of completeness, of totality, an artificial logic of totality that a materialist has, you get this sort of eating away from the inside. It's a feeling of crampedness, a feeling of essentially a lack of mystery. And that, for Chesterton, is why we require mystery and why we ought to affirm mystery. And essentially, the whole point of this chapter is to combat the idea that religion and spiritualism is dogmatism. That's a very common stereotype of the religious person, that they're just fundamentalist, dogmatic people who won't consider stuff outside their worldview. But for Chesterton, it's actually the precise opposite. The scientist, the materialist, the rationalist, these are the worldviews which cannot accept anything outside of themselves. And that, for Chesterton, is why we as humans require mystery. And essentially, for Chesterton, that is because the world is itself a mystery. And that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And may God bless you all.